Okay, we're recording.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Gypsy and Traveller Inclusive Services training that we're going to be delivering today. It's great to be back. Always have a fantastic response from the city and the district of Cambridge and Cambridgeshire as well. So happy to be here today. If you want to just turn the slides, James, we'll start giving you a little bit about an intro.
I can't get any sound through mine, Jenny.
Well,
I can't get any sound. I can hear yours.
Just say. Can we just go on mute if we're not actually going to be talking at this point? Okay, do you want to just go through the agenda, James? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And just quickly introduce myself. My name's James O'Neill. I'm a training officer for Friends Family Travellers. I am from an Irish traveller background, my mum being an Irish traveller and my dad being from a settled community. So I feel like I've got a sort of fair understanding of both communities. I'll be controlling the slides today. I will be happy to answer any questions that anyone has, and I'll also be contributing along the way, but Michelle will be your main host, and I'll just quickly run through the agenda for everyone. So starting with an intro, just like I just introduced myself, and a little bit of an introduction about Gypsy, Roma, traveller, people and culture. We'll then be looking at hate crime, which is obviously a very broad topic. Unauthorised encampments, which is a big talking point and can raise a lot of issues. And then following on from unauthorised encampments, we'll be looking at further site provision, best practice, and giving good practice examples on how we can help alleviate that situation. And at the end, we'll be doing a Q&A. I'm not sure if anyone just overheard us just talking, but just to let you know, the session is being recorded, but once the Q&A begins, I'll stop the recording. So feel free to ask any questions you've got. We're not here to sort of judge people and criticize people. We're here to just answer questions and hopefully give some understanding of the communities and help the situation around hate crime and unauthorised encampments.
I haven't.
Okay, I will move along to begin the session, and I think, is it me or you, Michelle?
Yeah, that's fine. Before we start, actually, I'm just going to, because I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Michelle Gavin. I've worked at FFT for 13 years on a variety of different parts of the project. My background is I was married to an Irish traveller man for 21 years, very happily, Michael. So prior to working at FFT, I was supporting him. He had an organisation called the GATE, which is Gypsy and Irish Travellers Association Southeast Region, and he worked with my colleague, who I'm going to introduce and get her to introduce herself now. So we're very lucky to have her expertise today as well. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks, Michelle. My name's Chris Penfold Brown. I'm a English Romany Gypsy. I came off the road in my teens, so I'd like to think I can put a little bit of experience forward from what I went through myself, being a gypsy and being sent to school, etc., etc. I worked for West Sussex Police from Lewis for 15 years as an advisor. At the beginning, Michelle's husband and myself, Michael, we were the founder members of it, and we achieved lots of things through the police and to benefit our people. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, wonderful. If we want to go straight into an overview of gypsies and travellers today, so we're looking at approximately 300,000 in the United Kingdom. Now, this is might be slightly elevated now. We've got the statistics and figures that have come out from the last census, slightly higher for gypsies and travellers, and significantly higher for Roma people actually in this particular census, but a huge undercount. So these figures here at 300,000 for gypsies and travellers is using a formula as well by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who believe there's still a 6 times undercount of people from the community in there for many, many reasons. Probably people are very, very anxious not to reveal their ethnicity through all walks of their life because of what is happening currently and what's happened historically as well. So these are good figures. There's probably about 200 to 250,000 Roma people in the country as well on top of this right now. But we know for gypsies and travellers today, about 2/3 are in bricks and mortar and 1/3 in caravans. So for those, that's often surprises people. that a majority of people from the communities are living in bricks and mortar. But if you look at the backdrop of the fact there's a chronic shortage of sites, that legislation has made it very, very difficult for people to continue to pursue a nomadic way of life. The fact that people can't access services if they are nomadic, and although, you know, even like healthcare services, people can't actually access those with no address, because even though the NHS and the Constitution say that it's free at the point of access, in reality, there are lots of fettered policies in place which might go against the Constitution and not particularly, and the legality of the Equalities Act, etc. But people still continue to do that. So it really has reduced the number of people who are actually living nomadically or in pertinent accommodations such as trailers. So that infographic will show you the ratio: 8 houses to 4 caravans, 2.5 of those on sites that have got authorization, so private sites and local authority sites, housing association sites, and that leaves 1.5 of those caravans on the side of the road. So we're looking at approximately, if you take into account the amount of people that will be in that caravan, gypsies and travellers tend to have a lot more children at a younger age. So it's, you know, it would be a family household, could be up to 10 people in that respect. So we're looking at approximately 25,000 individuals that haven't got any place to stop that is authorised. And since the change in the law, if people are going on pieces of unauthorised land, they are no longer held under civil law and the civil sections of trespass. It's now a criminal offence up to section 4 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which actually became an act this time last year. And I think it's a couple of days ago. It's been out for a full year now. So that has had an impact, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. So large populations in various areas of the UK. Think about gypsies and travellers. Romany gypsies particularly are you know, very scattered community. When you consider what happened in the history of gypsies and travellers and the law that came out from the Egyptians Act of 1530, which made it illegal to actually be a gypsy in this country. What it did is it forced people out of the cities and the sort of urban districts, and it made people scatter out throughout the countryside and do a work to earn money. People would move from place to place in rural districts, bringing in harvests, working on farms, improving the areas, etc. And that's continued. But you have large sort of like communities in certain areas still. So Irish travellers, completely opposite. They came in very much urban areas, particularly after the Second World War, when there'd been a lot of bomb damage. They would come in, they would encamp on the old bomb sites, and then they'd go to a different site and rebuild it. It could be a factory, it could be a road, it could be a fleet of council housing. So places like Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, London, you know, those city places, Manchester will have a larger population of Irish travellers in them, a majority being in bricks and mortar as well. So a lot of people that stayed there, they actually got accommodation and brought their families around. So there's larger sort of community populations there. But in the gypsy communities, there'll be pockets of large populations. For example, a place in Sussex called Hailsham has got a very large population of Romany people, you know, from those days when there was a lot of agriculture, but people have settled in bricks and mortar. You have a population in South Cambridgeshire, which has got quite a large population. You have places in Leeds. There's pockets around the country. Kent has got a large proportion of people because, of course, that was the Garden of England, and a lot of people were doing a lot of rural fruit picking or supporting farming there. Surrey has got a very large, again, population of Romanis, and there will be pockets in various areas of the United Kingdom, but there will be people everywhere. If you consider that figure of 300,000 against the actual census figures, you're looking at about 1 in 200 people are from the Gypsy Roma populations. So 1 in 200. So you will have people all around the country, but there is no sort of like specific areas that you say this is a really big Romany area or this is a really big Irish traveller area, because the population is quite scattered to be there. We know that Romany gypsies, Irish and Scottish travellers are legally recognised ethnic minorities, and they are protected under the Equalities Act 2010. So there's also a public duty there to support these communities under the protection of race. The relationships between the different groups are interesting. what happens generally with marginalized groups, it tends to be a section when you've been sort of lumped together. So quite unhelpfully, I would suggest. The term GRT, or Gypsy Roma Traveller, or GTR, Gypsy Traveller Roma, was sort of coined by statutory services several years ago. And it kind of intimated that this group of people were a homogenous group, but actually the group of Gypsies, Roma and Traveller are incredibly diverse. Many different cultures within that, some with shared cultural experience of nomadism, others not so, different language. So for example, Christine, she speaks Romanesque, and that is the language of Romany people and also from Roma people. But Chris, it varies, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's a dialect depending where you are in the country. You know, my Cornish cousins will speak the same words but pronounced differently.
Absolutely. And it's, you know, and some of the languages like seeped into the English vocabulary as well, you know, particularly words. And I often use this example, kushti. People think that's a Del Boy Trotter word. And actually it's not, it's a Romanesque word, Chris, isn't it?
Yeah, kushti meaning good. It's a very wide used word. It gets used a lot because life is kushti in itself. So it does get used a lot. But the Del Boy situation with Only Fools and Horses, if you listen to them, there's quite a lot of words. They say one of them is wonga, and I've heard people copying it and saying it, but the actual word is a V, not a W, so it is wonga. But when the research was done and the questions were asked by the researchers, we always got told to pronounce our language differently just to try and keep it a little bit secret. But of course, it's too late now because you've even got a dictionary. So yeah, it's not Wonga, but it is a Vonga.
Vonga as well. And of course,
also, sorry, Michelle, but I was watching it just the other day. I thought of you, and he says when the chavi comes along. So there's chavi as well in there, which is our language. Is the real word is chavangro. It gets shortened to chavi, and even Del Boy uses that.
And for those of you who don't know, that means child. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I'll give you an update. So yeah, and of course Irish travellers have their own language too. So that's cant or the gammon, and it might be words like some words that you might recognise, like fiend, which is man, bure, which is a woman, lachin, which is a girl. So there's certain words that are particularly used, and of course to have you know, your ethnicity recognised, one of the sort of like benchmarks is having your own language as well. But the relationship between the different groups, you know, traditionally people would have travelled together in their family groups, in their wider family groups as well. These days, there's a huge lack of sites, and ideally, people would have wanted to travel and encamp with their own family or extended family. And you're in a situation now where there's very few pitches available. So there's almost like it's a competition to who gets onto a particular site. So you are going to get a situation where they're going to be mixed sites where you might have Irish travellers on with Romany gypsies. And, you know, although things have improved, when you've got like communities sort of like vying for these really, really, you know, it's rarer than hen's teeth to get a pitch on a site. So, you know, people will feel, you know, oh, well, this site's a Romany site, it hasn't got Irish travellers on it. But then, you know, if you look at allocation policies, that will be like, well, actually, there's no fettering within that policy. You know, it's for everybody who is nomadic who should be able to access that. So there will be some attentions about people being able to get onto sites from both sides of the community. And also then you can think about new travellers as well, who, although haven't got ethnic status, they are still travelling nomadically for economic purposes. So under planning terms, they are still entitled to have access to accommodation settings, such as sites, etc. But then, you know, if you look, although this is where I go into the point where you say, you know, this isn't a homogenous group, there's a group of people that might have some shared you know, points such as nomadism, but won't have shared cultures or customs, you know, so some will be shared and some won't. So it does become quite difficult, the relationship between the different groups, mainly because there's a huge lack of site provision across the country. And that means on unauthorized encampments as well. So people tend to stick to their own ethnic group or their own groups. There's not often an amalgamation. Although I've just got back from Glastonbury yesterday, and we had a a part of a field there called the Achintan, which means stopping places. And Damien Labar, someone's just put, I read stopping places, and he writes about some of the issues you're talking about. Absolutely, Louise. And Damien Labar was at Glastonbury, actually, so we had a great time, and we were at the Action Town, which is the stopping place there. And for the second year running, we had every type of traveller that we could representing there. So we had people who were horse-drawn there on this stopping place. You had Romany gypsies there. In fact, the steward or the guardianship of Appleby was there at the time, Billy Walsh. And then we had a wonderful Irish traveller man called Thomas McCarthy, who was there doing storytelling. We had new travellers there representing, their part within this rich fabric and culture. So it was diverse, and people are coming more together in solidarity now, because it's recognised that you need to have that solidarity to make a change in movement. But I think the fact that there's 25,000 people with no authorised place to stop, that shows you something. I think sometimes we have to come together in solidarity to get those changes made. But it's very, very difficult when you have got different groups who are all looking for the same thing. And I don't know, I mean, it's not so common. I mean, it's more common now. I mean, Chris, you'd probably agree with this, where you have people from the Irish traveller community marrying people from the Romany community than it was many years ago.
Yeah, it was very, very rarely heard of, Michelle, years ago. But now it is, it's common, and it's just making it even more diverse and open. So I don't see that as a bad thing. But back in the day, they went to quite a few lengths to prevent that happening. But of course, nothing lasts forever.
No, it doesn't. And even I've worked with a lot of people from the New Traveller community, and you don't have to actually go back very far in their sort of like genealogy, isn't it? I can't remember the word you say, but in their family history, to actually find that they have a quite recent family member who's come from a nomadic community, such as a Romany community or Roma community. I know a lot of people that I've done work with over the years who present as new travellers, but like their grandfathers have been Irish traveller, an Irish traveller mother, or grandparents have been Roma people. So it's kind of what's bred in the bones sometimes, even though it might come across it's like a choice thing. Not often you'll find us scratch the surface and you'll find somebody that's got that sort of background too, and that's just so normalized, and I found it so often. It was really interesting. Someone will do some research on that one day, I'm sure, but there we go. And I think on this slide it says the importance of positive language, and I think that the language that is used with the communities generally has been negative. Let's be honest about it, including the way maybe local authorities sometimes and central government use certain words like incursions and try to dehumanize groups of people and human beings, and it puts you in the mind. I've seen some policy documents over the years which says like where they've called a family a unit rather than a family, because it makes it much easier if you're writing a policy document and you sort of like cut off your mind as these people being groups of families, grandparents, parents, children, etc. And using language such as incursion brings up that feeling of like, a war, something going on. So the importance of positive language is really, really important. I don't know if you want to add anything, Chris, on that?
No, you've covered that, Michelle. That's how it seems to be.
Yeah, and James, it's the same, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just coincidentally, this morning I was actually doing a bit of research about the Church of England stopping places, and I clicked on a Mail Online article. So I kind of knew what I was getting myself into, but just a quick look on the comments, there's like 29 comments, and I mean, it certainly wasn't positive language in those comment sections. So language is massively important, and words do matter. And it can make a difference to just think about the wording you use, think about what you're saying, and it might sound like a small thing, but it can actually make a big difference.
Absolutely. Do you want to move on to the next slide, James? So we're going to talk a little bit now about, hate speech as well. Hate crime and discrimination, they're all very separate items. We've had a hate crime officer at FFT for some time, and we work with other organisations such as Heartsgate, who are a third-party reporting organisation for hate crime and hate speech. We know from the police that it's something that isn't reported very often, and that's because people are so used to it. It's a terrible thing to say, but also a lot of people from the community do not trust the police enough to contact them because for fear of not being believed. So often FFT on our casework line, we'll get people contacting us about an incident that's happened to them, and then we will be the advocate that maybe put the police report in or support somebody. But police officers consider hate crime to be the most common issue Gypsy, Roma and travellers report to them. So that's interesting, but still less than 15% of hate incidents are reported to the police. So we know this is an issue, but we also know that it's still hugely underreported. And sadly, it happens constantly. I mean, I was talking to you, Chris, the other day, and you were saying about your neighbour. Now, this is just a bit of casual racism that was coming up, but these things can actually manifest themselves much more deeply, can't they? When you said that she was concerned that some gypsies had pulled up or something.
Yeah, she messaged me and said, if you're in today, Chris, could you mind keeping an eye on my house, because I've got lots of parcels coming and I'm frightened the gypsies will steal them. And it's nothing to me, because I know people don't even know it's a hate crime or being discriminate. Even they're not aware of it, and they're not unfriendly. But it's so stereotyped that it's, it doesn't bother me. I don't take, when you've been sort of verbally attacked for the first part of your life, you get a very thick skin. So you take no notice of it, and you don't blame them, because that is how they think. It's not their fault.
And I think that probably takes you back as well to when you were a young person, when you were a child growing up on the side of the road, Chris, the sort of things that happened to you in the school place, and that happened to you, from the police even. What happened?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they moved us from one side of the road to the other. And that was after we'd set up. My father had lit the fire. My mother had prepared the food. Actually, the pot was actually on the fire. And there was 4 of us, my sister as well, and the policeman stopped. And funny enough, it was on the Salisbury Plain as well. And he just came and said, "No, you have to move." And my father said, "Why are you doing this?" Because you're looking at an hour to set up, really. By the time you've got your china out and made the beds and stuff, you lit the fire, it is an hour to move again. And he said, from one side of the road to the other. When my father asked him why, he said, "Because I can." And what sort of mood would he have gone off in? It must have made him feel better to go home. Well, I don't know. Well, why would someone do that to a family that were just committing no crime at all? He just felt, like he said, he did it because he could.
Yeah, and the schools as well. I know that both that you'd had a particularly difficult time at school, Chris, because you were sort of like targeted for being a Romany gypsy, aren't you?
Yeah, again, I didn't blame the children, because I was told from my parents that it's not the children's fault. But in my case, the teachers were worse than the children, which changes it a little bit, because you can blame them. They shouldn't have done what they did and made me feel like I did, because they were teachers. They were responsible adults. I didn't blame the children, but I did blame the teachers, and they were poor, really poor.
And I know there's that story that where the teacher particularly made everyone draw a picture of their home. I think that's something that really comes up.
And she must have been quite clever, because she realised that I was going to lie. And so she probably thought, well, let's test this. So she made us draw a picture of our home. And I did, as she suspected. I drew a big house, which was a lie, because she knew I was in a caravan. And she obviously did it intentionally, because the child that collected all the pictures took them to her, and she went through them quickly to try and find mine. And she held it up in the classroom and said, everyone knows. They didn't all know, not all the kids, they didn't know, but she made sure they did. And she said, "We know you're lying." And I didn't even get called Christine. I got called Penfold. That was my name, like a mouse, like a danger mouse thing. So Penfold, everyone knows you're lying. You do not live in a house. You live in a caravan. And she went out of her way to do that again, to the humiliation. So we had a good training at home, though. My father would sit you down, and he'd prepare you to accept things like this and not to knock it back. Don't get down about it. You know, this is going to happen. So just get on with it. And thankfully it doesn't bother you, you know.
And James, I know that you basically did not reveal your ethnicity, did you, when you were at school or in the workplace?
At all, definitely not. No, I went to school in London, in central London, all boys Catholic school, quite rough and tumble, to say the least. And yeah, I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friends in school, that I have an Irish traveller background. It just wouldn't have been something I would have said, for fear of situations arising, like Chris just discussed, for fear of bullying from pupils and teachers. And there was one Irish traveller in my school who, I don't know, I'm not actually sure why, or I'm surprised that it was sort of a known thing that he was an Irish traveller, because I doubt he would have sort of spoke up and said it himself. He actually lived on a site in Camden, probably still, not maybe still does. And I remember literally feeling sorry for him. Whenever I'd see him, I'd actually just have that kind of feeling, like sinking feeling, like, oh, they know about him. Do you know, like as if it was something to be really ashamed of or to be worried. You know, it's really like only when you sort of get older and you reflect on things, you kind of can appreciate how sort of unfair and like, you know, wrong.
I have to say though, James, that when you said you didn't say, no one says. I'd never said that I was a gypsy. And I used to say to the children, why are you doing this? How do you know I'm a gypsy? 9 out of 10 of them would say, because you've got a clothes peg stuck up your ass. You know, where did it come from? I know I look different because I was sent to school without a uniform. That may be part of the upbringing from your parents. You know, look, you might not, you know, you weren't supposed to deny what you were, but you'd never ever say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Say.
Yeah, you would definitely never say it. And even in carrying on through to sort of my sort of work life and adult life, this is the first job I've ever been. I'm 38, and this is the first job I've ever sort of openly said I'm an Irish traveller. I would never have said it in any previous position, you know, like yeah. And even at the beginning, sort of, I've just for the benefit of people in the session, I've only sort of been working for FFT for about 4 or 5 months. And for the first probably 6 weeks on sessions like this, talking and actually saying it over, it was very unnerving and unsettling. It just felt uncomfortable and really sort of counterintuitive to.
Oh yeah, yeah, I understand
right
that
now, but it is yeah. And the more you sort of think about it and reflect on it, because it's all you know. So when you're used to something, that's all you've ever known. You don't sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees until you step away from something and look at it.
That is so true, James, and a very good point, because when I started with the police, I felt like I was going to be arrested any second. I hadn't done anything.
But that guilt feeling,
it took me 2 years to settle in and to be comfortable being at the meetings, because prior to that, like you said, all my jobs had been my ethnicity didn't count with the jobs that I've done, so it never arose. But I was actually there as a job advising the police, and it took 2 years to sink in. I kept having to pinch myself, think, what am I doing here surrounded by police? What's going on?
It just, it's like every fibre in your body is like trying to stop you from doing this. It's a really strange thing, but that's wrong. You know, if I think of my own children, I think sometimes when you have your own children, you kind of look at them and kind of think, hold on, that's you know, when it's yourself, you can kind of just take it on the chin and you'll, you know, get on with things. But when you kind of then sort of hold on, you sort of look at your own children, you think if they were in the same situation, you wouldn't be happy with it. It's not right.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, as someone's just said, it's really sad that you've been made to feel that you cannot be your true self. And like, you know, it takes certain times, you know, of your life that you can do that. If you're a trailblazer and you do it right from the start, you know, it's not an easy passage or journey. And like Chris said, my husband, people just knew, you know, I mean, after a while of talking to him, they know he was a traveller, and there was something about him that just really used to annoy people because of people's entrenched feelings about, and taking us a little bit back to sort of discrimination and about how, if you think about how people view travellers, and even people that are, you know, very, very into equalities and equity, etc. If you think from being born, you're almost told that travellers are bad or gypsies are bad. You think about all the songs, you know, the gypsies are in the wood, they're going to steal your children. The gypsies are thieves. The gypsies are, you know, animalistic. The gypsies are, you know, they speak in a different language from you, so you can't trust them. All of these things, these tropes have been happening since like Romany gypsies came to Britain 1530, the Egyptians Act. They've started at that point. And that's when these tropes, and they've continued for centuries. And if you look at modern literature now and modern film, it's all in there, it's embedded. So if you look at sort of like Victorian poets, you know, there's either this feeling of romanticism around the wonderful, you know, life of a gypsy. You've got like artists like Constable who do pictures of like countryside settings with, you know, the old bow-top wagons and someone, you know, old granny smoking a pipe. There's a very different look according to the literature style or the arts of that time. But if you look at even pre-2000 film, the themes are the same. Gypsies as fighters, gypsies as being attuned to animals or being animalistic, gypsies as being untrustworthy. All of these things have been going on, and these are recycled tropes, and they've happened for centuries, and they continue in our news today and in our press. And because it's been drip fed into you, it's probably one of the most casual forms of racism and discrimination that you can actually have. So that takes us, we've just been talking about schools. We did something with the Anti-Bullying Alliance, a report called Bullied, Blamed and Not Believed, which you can get off of our website. And it has some very stark and shocking figures about how children are feeling and their experiences in the school place. And it's very accurate. Please have a look at that. And again, employment at work. I mean, James and Chris have just touched on that, about how, you know, how it's really difficult to actually, you know, say I'm a traveller when you're working. I've worked with people who've got a job. I'll give you an example. A young man who worked really hard to get a job in a local Tesco's. He got the job on his merit, and you know, he was given this job. He was due to start on a certain date. He got a call and a letter from Tesco saying that they had withdrawn the offer. Basically, they'd found out that he was from a large family of gypsies in that area, and they did not want him working in the store. So that was like discrimination, but it was very difficult to prove that. There's people that have been not even given, you know, as soon as you write down number 1 caravan, caravan house, caravan road, you're not even going to get a, you know, an interview. So there's a lot. Someone's just said, I grew up in Australia. Similarities between the Gypsy urban traveller and the Aboriginal culture. Absolutely. And this is like all of the discrimination and the hate that goes with it as well. You know, the service refusal that continues. Holiday camps, they're the classic. Pontins, there was something on in the media not that long ago. And as a result of it, we did train Pontins, but they weren't particularly bothered, I don't think. I think they just wanted a certificate, to be fair, because they were shown to have a fettered policy, but it was like it was an unwritten policy. But someone whistle blew to say anyone with a name like O'Neill, Morn, and Sweeney. They had a list of Irish traveller surnames. Basically, anyone that rang up to book in was to be told no, there's no spaces for them. I know so many people from the communities who have been turned away even after booking in. You can't get into a caravan site if you've got certain types of caravans. So like a hobby, for example, everyone knows that in the communities, most travellers will use certain types of caravans to live in as living vehicles, hobbies being one of them. Some hobbies are barred in caravan clubs. There's a lot of fettering policies about people coming into a caravan park with a transit van, for example. That's barred as well. So there's a lot of refusal of service. Weddings is a classic one. Although there's been Equalities and Human Rights Commission have taken certain places to court, it's very difficult to prove discrimination in some counts as well. But I've had to go down from my friends in the Irish traveller community and book venues because I don't have an accent. I can go in and pay and book a venue. But if they had gone in to pay and book a venue for, like, you know, a hen night or a hen party, they probably would have been refused service. So there's all of this that's going on. It happens with GPs. I've talked this story many a time when we've been given a refusal purely for somebody's surname. Again, you know, Mrs. McGinley, oh, we've got too many McGinleys on our books, we don't have to take you on. It goes against all of the Constitution. It goes against like equalities law. It is, you know, it's quite horrific actually. But people felt that they could say this. So, you know, some discrimination is more hidden than others, especially in the fact that it's not discriminating against you as an individual if you are discriminating against the type of caravan. but knowing that that caravan is used by a majority of that community. So it can be quite clever. Clothes shops, beauticians, pubs, clubs and restaurants, it's all normal. In fact, we did a YouGov survey, I think it was in 2020, and it actually came up with a result that I think about 56% of people, I think it was, I'll have to double check that, but it was a really high percentage felt, no, perhaps just a bit under 50% actually, felt that people should be turned away from restaurants and pubs if they were a traveller. I mean, that's, you know, certain parts of places, you know, these days you rarely see the no blacks, no Irish, no travellers, no dogs on doors and on posters, but you know, it used to happen all the time. It was just well known. That was something that happened in places like Manchester and Birmingham, etc. And there has been more recent pictures of no travellers welcome in more rural settings. I don't know if you've had any of those experiences, Chris.
Yeah, I was asked by the police to keep my eye out and to report any that I saw, and I came across a strange one in a pub, a local pub actually, and it was on a blackboard, and at the top some clever person put no, just NO in capital letters, and then he'd drawn a pie, like a beef pie.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
And then a bunch of keys, you know, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't report it because it was just a pie and a bunch of keys. And he just laughed at me, and he said, well, it doesn't say pie key. And I said, might as well. So they get around it.
Yeah, I mean, that shows it's really offensive, isn't it, as well?
Yeah.
And do you know how many people don't think that word pikey is a racist term? You know, I've spoken to police officers in the past down in the West Country who said, it's not that, that's just it's just something that we all use. It's so casual. It's so casual.
They don't know in Sussex,
No.
in Lewis, a lot of the officers didn't know.
Yeah.
And the officer that he was, the officer was called Tony, and he was the first to arrest someone for using the word after it went through that it was an official illegal word. And the chap got fined £1,100 for saying it. And Tony, the police officer, got complaints from local people calling him a gypsy lover. And he said in a meeting, what can you do? I can't do anything right. I arrest the guy for saying pikey, and then he gets ridiculed for the arrest.
Absolutely. It's crazy, isn't it?
It just goes around in circles. It's madness.
It does. And I think we're just types of hate. We know there's hate speech, so that's very, very common. Hate crime as well is usually like types of hate, like when someone is physically hurt as a result of a hate attack. And there's something, you know, I'm just thinking of an incident that happened in Surrey not that long ago, when somebody had actually taken the time and trouble to go onto the edge of a traveller's site, it was a private site, and write, you know, pikeys get out or something to that respect on their wall, on their wooden like paneling. And the elder gypsy man came out to clean it off, and it was been done with acid. So he actually cleaned it off, and he got acid burns in his hands, and he had to go to hospital. So he was actually, you know, it was a hate attack, that one, and it was treated as a serious crime. It's still open, that crime. It's never been found, even though it was on a main road. People would have seen someone doing that, and yet no one's come forward with it. I mean, the types of online hate and abuse is huge, especially with like social media, Twitter accounts. You know, it's very easy to just retweet something that someone said, and it's so casual and so, you know, hideous. Some of the things, I mean, Chris, you know, I'm just thinking about some of the things that have hit the news and been quite important. Things like the bonfires down in Lewis. I don't know if anyone here, Lewis is like known for its bonfires. Every year they have bonfire, sort of what you would call clubs, different areas. And they had one where they had, you know, a caravan which they burnt with children in the window. No,
yeah, they had a friend of mine, Patricia Knight, she's a photographer, and it was her image with her two daughters.
Yeah.
And you could see them in the back of the caravan, and they took it right up through the street and the display, and then set light to the whole thing with the children and Patricia in it. She did find it quite funny in a way. She felt sorry and a bit sad for the people that decided to do it. But why would you think of doing something like that?
Absolutely. And of course there are physical attacks on people as well. I mean, you know, I remember a physical attack. A client of mine they'd been evicted from one area, and then they had to move to a different district. So they'd gone to like sort of mid Sussex. They'd moved from Brighton to mid Sussex, and she just had a baby. So she had a newborn baby who also had problems with breathing. So they had an oxygen tank in there for the child because it was very early. They moved onto this piece of land, and it was obviously the wrong move, because locals had come around and they had actually thrown bricks at the caravans, and one of the bricks had gone through her window and missed her baby by inches. And that is, that's the realities of living on unauthorized areas sometimes, the hate that comes up. And I know during COVID, when there wasn't anyone saying, when everyone was meant to be living, you're not allowed to leave the house, you're not allowed to do this, that, and the other, a lot of travellers came out of the woodwork. They were in unauthorized places, or they were just hidden, and they had to come out because no one had thought about giving them water, toilet, sanitation, anything. They'd been left. And what happened, the rise in hate actually increased, because people thought that the travellers who were out on these bits of land were sort of like throwing their hands up and not staying to the rules. So, sometimes just providing a bin in that area or providing a portaloo means that people will not have the type of hate that is thrown at them, because they feel that there's some type of, permission to be there. So physical attacks happen. There was that poor young lad, Johnny Delaney, up in Manchester, some years ago, who was attacked by some other schoolboys who was coming home from school, and he was kicked to death, basically. And when the judge looked at it, he didn't put it down as a race hate crime, and it was absolutely 100%. So it's something that that family that have had to live with, because that boy died as a result of his race at the time. And I'm just going to quickly go on to discrimination around, and then we're going to talk about Eric Pickles. So Eric Pickles, as you know, was the secretary for local government communities some years ago. And what he did specifically was he used to pull in. So if you had planning, pieces of planning that were put around the country, he would what he would call in every single planning application that had been passed or denied or whatever into his office, and he would make the final decision if it was on the green belt. And in 2015, a group of people took it to court, and he was found to be discriminating against gypsies and travellers as a result of this policy, which wasn't a policy at all. It was something that was completely made up. He literally he was found that it was unlawful discrimination was put forward, but basically it was against statute as well. So the Community Law Partnership brought the case on behalf of 2 women and to actually challenge this, and it was absolutely enormous, because it added around 100 gypsy traveller planning appeals were overseen personally by Eric Pickles from July 13 to that point in 2015, which were looked at. And they were very concerned. It was the Equalities and Human Rights Commission that actually called in that call-in policy was unfair on gypsies, and they said we have a duty to protect everyone from discrimination and ensure that the law is applied fairly, consistently and equally for all. So that was a specific individual at that time that was taken to court over that. So that gives you a bit of an idea about discrimination in site provision as well, and those calling ins at the time. And if you remember the backdrop to Dale Farm as well, Eric Pickles' name on the lips of anyone from the community was pretty, that man, used to, everybody, knew from the community that he was discriminating against community. Unfortunately, the judges ruled that he was. Do you remember that, Chris? All that
yes,
wonderful
I do,
time?
yeah, you just made me smile, because you're very polite, Michelle. I couldn't even say what was said before Eric Pickles' name at the time.
No. I'm trying to be polite here today.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Eric Pickles, that discrimination in site provision was there. And I think someone's just popped in the chat as well about the recent new legislation which will make life more difficult to gypsy, Roma and traveller. And it's absolutely true, because that piece of legislation was actually part of the Conservative manifesto at the time. So that's why it went through And that's why there was a determination for the government, for the sitting government, to put it through, because it was part of their manifesto that got them, into government at the time. We did an awful lot of work to push back against that, but unfortunately the Section 4 of the Police Courts Crime Sentencing Act, which became law this time last year, actually, just the day that Glastonbury finished, it became law. So that meant that anybody who was on a bit of unauthorised land, could be brought to book by the police or the agents of the state at all. The Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act 2022, you're absolutely right. Which meant that anyone on that land, it was no longer a civil offence, it made it a criminal offence. So in effect, what you would do is you could be fined about £3,000 if you didn't move. You could have your home taken off you and destroyed, and you could basically, if you're on the side of the road, that could have another sort of like wash of issues around. If you've got children with you, that children's services could intervene and take your children and put them in a place of because you weren't actually having protective parenting. So all of these things, and that's purely because you are on an unauthorised encampment as a Romany Gypsy or traveller with an ethnic background as well, or who literally, has a right to roam in this country. But what happened, sadly, if you look at history and you look at the legislation that's happened right the way from the Egyptians Act of 1530, but like going back into the 1700s, the 1600s, but really looking at the Highways Act in the 50s, looking at the act of one of the worst ones was the 1960 Caravans and Sites Act, which took away, I think it was under section 38, I think, which took away the rights of individuals from the community to actually park up on common land. So that was part of the Common Land Act, which was all part of that. And it actually took away, so people have been traveling for literally, sort of like decades, for hundreds of years, and stopping on pieces of common land around the country. And suddenly they were no longer allowed to unless they had a license to do so. And people that have bought their own land and lived there on caravans, they too had to go and get a license to legitimize their position. Otherwise, they could be kicked off their own land. And all of this legislation has been literally there in so many forms for so long that the idea is to try to legislate gypsies and travellers out of existence, basically, and that nomadic way of life, which has been protected in law by the Human Rights Act and by the courts, to say that the UK government have to promote and support a nomadic way of life because it matches the ethnic background and status drop. But in effect, all of this legislation is there to erase it. So this new law is going to do that eventually, because what we're talking about at the moment, like nobody has actually brought a case for the last year under this legislation, because the police have said right from the beginning that they didn't think it was necessary. They were actually against this law because there's so much legislation that they have got that they can use under the Criminal Justice Act of 1994 and Public Order Act. They can use Section 61 to move people from A to B. They can use the Section 62A to move people, to into a site if necessary, if people are encamped. There's also Section 77 of the Highways Act, which could be used for people that are on the side of the road as well, on which the local authority can use as an agent of the state. So there's so much legislation. And there was civil law as well, part of 55, civil law, that you'd go to the court. But no, this new legislation is there. Now, you might think, oh, well, no one's using it. Well, that's fine at the moment. But at one point, someone will use it. And then as time goes on, you'll have councillors or you'll have people that are working in that locality who are saying, well, Bristol used it or Somerset used it. You've got to use that. There'll be a pressure. And then, of course, the police will be pressured into using that legislation. And before you know it, it becomes normal to use that legislation. So at the moment, no one is putting their foot forward because there might be a challenge legally. But at the same time, I can guarantee you, as soon as it happens, it will be like a domino effect. And that's what the worry is. That's what the worry is, because the police at the moment, they're really happy. They don't want to use it, but there will be a point. when they will use it. So that's why it's really important, I think, to look at this issue, think about, you know, what's going to happen in the future, lobby your MPs, lobby your areas to say this is not a good piece of law, or at the same time, look at ways to support the community by introducing new methods of stopping. So sort of unauthorized encampments, you could have like negotiated stopping, or in Bristol, they've got something called meanwhile sites that they offer to people in the meanwhile, while there is no provision available. And then, of course, you know, think about building transit provision, think about building more sites. All of these things are really important. So I think, you know, that will give you a bit of an idea. Do you want to move on to the next slide, James? Because So I think we've been talking a little bit about this, types of accommodation. So as it stands, we have local authority sites. So those sites have been built and managed generally by the local authority or one of their agents. And they come in the form of two types, which is permanent site provision and transit pitches. Now, transit sites are few and far between. In fact, the whole of Surrey doesn't have a transit site. When you consider the amount of gypsies and travellers in a district like Surrey, you need to have that site if you're moving from one county to another county. If you don't have transit provision, how can anyone continue to have a nomadic pattern of life for looking for work purposes? You need to be able to go at least from one county to another and stop off at a transit site if possible. There's a huge lack of transit sites in the country. In fact, you know, you could travel hundreds and hundreds of miles before you get to the next one. So I don't think the city of Cambridge has got one, for example, but it probably could do with a transit facility because of the amount of people that will be visiting that district. Or would visit it and stay there for a temporary time to visit people in hospital, for example, or to go to travellers' fairs, weddings. The same with South Cambridgeshire. This is an area that, you know, is underfunded, it's underserved for the community. We need transit provision or something similar too. When I say transit provision, I mean something that is fit for purpose, because we've done a lot of research and there are sites that are transit sites across the country that are nothing but literally a concreted area with no facilities at all. And there's one in the West Midlands, and what they use on their Gypsy traveller accommodation needs assessment. So we've got pictures here, we've got this transit site, no one uses it. It's called a dummy site and it's been put in place literally for the figures at that point, but there's no water, there's no toilets, and it's like behind a huge walls, and it looks a little bit like, and as it's a quote from a traveller, a concentration camp. So why would you go there to sit and stay where you are literally penned in an area which has nothing? A good transit site will have a really nice large pitches, it will have really clean toilet facilities and showering facilities, have good water for each station, as it were, and have access to electric as well during those things. And like, some are fantastic, some transit sites are wonderful and really, really accommodating, others not so. But they are seen as an important part of travelling, because if you are, you know, on the one hand, the government say you've got to be travelling to be a traveller under ethnic status or under any sort of planning status, but on the other hand, there's nowhere to actually stop, because as I said before, the 1960s Caravans and Sites Act stopped people actually being able to stop on the common land, which they'd done for centuries. People were forced out of those areas, they were forced onto the side of the road, so they brought in a new legislation to stop people pulling up on the highways. And then it was in 1969, I think it was the other Caravans Act, which was Lord Avebury, Eric Lubbock, who actually brought in a private member's bill in Parliament to look at what help could be given to travellers at that time. And this bill, as a result of the 60s Act, actually put a duty on local authorities to provide sites for gypsies and travellers, which was a huge thing. And this went on. So initially, local authorities would have the money to build sites. I'm thinking of Bromley, I'm thinking of all around the country. There are sites that have been built as a result of that particular act. What happened, of course, when the Criminal Justice Act of 1994 came in, one of the key things that it did was it rescinded the duty of local authorities. So it took that duty away from local authorities to provide sites for gypsies and travellers. So it was short-lived. you think 69 till 94. But even during that time, local authorities would do their best not to provide gypsy and traveller sites because it wasn't something that people wanted in their localities. But, you know, you did have a duty, it was there, and there were sites built. But as soon as 1994 came along, that stopped completely. As a result of this legislation. So we've not had a lot of new sites built, probably from the 80s, really. If you look at that, we're just doing a study, so it will be out soon. It's about local development plans and how many sites have been built since those acts came into place, and also from the act from the new legislation that came out in 2015, which changed the definition of what being a gypsy and traveller was. Now, thank the Lord, the Lisa Smith case, it's taken 8 years more or less from the beginning of when Mark Villas, who's our trustee, actually went to the courts to try to get this overturned, and he was refused on many occasions to actually challenge it in the courts. Eventually, he was able to do so with the backing of FFT as interveners and others, and we got the law changed back, which is a huge thing because it actually increased the need of assessed gypsy travellers for site provision. All that has done is change the definition. So basically, it was another attempt to reduce what numbers there were of people waiting to go into permanent accommodation in those particular areas. So it will affect people's building permanent sites. The lack of site availability is so huge. There's at least 1,700 families on waiting lists across England. Now, when I say families, you're looking at maybe 10 in a family group, but this is only a tip of the iceberg because we went out and we contacted all of the sites, and only a percentage of them returned to us with that information. It's quite unbelievable to think that, you know, this new legislation is going to be targeting people who literally have nowhere to live. They've got their homes, but they're statutorily homeless, and those homes will have children in them. You can guarantee it, because it's the emerging people that have got issues. So if you've got a site, you don't leave it. You know, the only reason you get a pitch comes up generally is if someone dies. So you're waiting for people to die on sites for you to be able to access them. It's really awful. So that lack of site availability is huge. The gypsy travel accommodation assessments and the planning definitions, those whole things, the GTAAs, now people that are taking or looking at their needs, their assessed needs, now they have to go back to the original pre-2015 definition, which says, you know, you can have a temporary abeyance from travelling if you are, you know, somebody that's a single parent, or you have a protected characteristic, you know, of disability or old age, for example, because that took it away from after the 2015 definition was changed. You know, that the 2015 definition changed, and it reduced it by about 60% of people who needed it. Now everybody should be redoing their assessments and putting the new figures in again to show what the assessed need is, basically, because that will have a big impact on your local development plans as well, etc. You know, so it's quite I mean, it's quite technical, some of this stuff, but I think it gives you a flavour of what's been happening over the years to sort of erase the nomadic culture and the nomadic lives of people in this country, and to actually take away that. And this is why we're going back to that 300,000, you know, eight houses to 4 caravans, you know, that type of sort of like ratio. You can understand why we're where we are. Think about private sites. So what happened as well when during the time after the Caravans Act and the fact that sites weren't being built, it was very much pushed on local on gypsies and travellers from government to go out and find their own sites and build them. They were told to go out, you find the land, build your site, and we'll give you planning permission. So that's what people did. But of course, it never happened. People weren't given planning permission, Chris. Can you remember this time when everyone was encouraged to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. And they were believed as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, and people then suddenly had the Town and Country Planning Act to look at. And suddenly they were going, well, we bought the land, we did what you said, and you're turning us down on the Town and Country, because I've never seen a document as big as the Town and Country Planning Act. It's about that thick, it really is. But there's a special section just for Gypsy and Traveller planning. And, you know, with all of the, you know, you have to prove that you've looked around for local authority sites, you've done everything you can to find an alternative than go onto a piece of land. Then you have to start with brown sites, and then if you can't find any brown sites in your area, then you have to go out. It's like a concentric circle. You have to look further and further until you're in Greenbelt. Then you have to show why it's important and why it's that you're that important to have that site. Why should they break the idea of Greenbelt for you as a special circumstance? And often that means telling your life. You know, I've actually got, you know, one kidney, one of my legs doesn't work, I've got really bad health anxieties, I've got X, Y, and Z, my children have got disabilities, I need them to go into school. You have to give a real personal account and detail into why that you're an exceptional circumstance. And then the inspector or the planning officer will look at that and see whether in the balance and weighting and in Wednesbury way, whether you are entitled, whether you are worthy of having that pitch for yourself and actually giving you permission to be on your own land. This is a terrible process. There's a lot of work that goes into this. Also, people often buy, you know, people were not told about what to look for. They just thought, oh, we can buy a bit of land. A lot of that land often has been sold to them with enforcement notices on it already, or stop notices that they can't actually use that piece of land. You know, there's a lot more to it than that. If you get permanent permission, you are meant to go into mains sewerage. You're meant to go into, you know, you can't keep on using a temporary sort of like a sewage system, etc., etc. It becomes very expensive as well. And people aren't rich. Most people put all of their money, and the whole family will put their money in to get a piece of land. And then often it's turned down. So you then have to go through the process of, like, at local level, it's been denied. Then you have to go to the inspectorate in Bristol to have it looked at again to see if that planning will be allowed. It is so stressful. And then we talk about what Eric Pickles did, who pulled in every single Gypsy or Traveller planning application because he could, a bit like your police officer, Chris, at that time, until the court said he couldn't. So this is the stress. I've known people that have died waiting for their planning, of the stress.
Oh.
The stress. It's just horrible. I've
My parents,
yeah, carry on, Chris.
sorry, Michelle. My parents were 5 years fighting. 5 years, and every single alleyway they blocked, every single one. And then they had to come up with prove that you can put this land in agriculture. Can you earn, you know, can you earn your living from the land? It just, they went round and round in circles. And the newspaper report was the Gypsy family that can afford to stay but are forced to live in a pig hut or something like that. 5 years
Right.
went on, over round and round in circles.
Well, you have to laugh because you often see the like the headlines in the newspaper saying Gypsies and Travellers, they've come in over a weekend, they've conquered this, they think they can, like, subvert the planning situation. Well, I'm telling you now, I've gone through the journey with families it's taken 5-8 years to get planning permission. They might have been given a 3 years temporary, and then that 3 years is up and their hearts are like this, they're worried. You know, they can be continually given temporary permission. At some point, you know, not even a permanent permission, or they've been given permission, but it's in their name only, so they can't hand it on to their children. I mean, some of the variations in conditions of planning are brutal. So I know the anxiety that fulfills. And most of the time, if you've got an application, all of this information about the positive sides, why you should be giving this land to, why you're allowing this family who own this land to have permission to reside there, against all of the negative comments that come in from these little organizations that pop up because they don't want gypsies in their area, because they think it's going to impact on the amount of money they can sell their property for, or that crime's going to go up. All of these terrible tropes that are fed into. You know, I mean, it was interesting that if you did a mapping exercise of where the Gypsy sites are in your area, you'll notice that this is all rubbish. You know, places like now, Brighton and Hove City Council finally got permission for our site here X amount of years ago. It was called in, but we managed to subvert that quite quickly because Janet Whitaker is one of our sort of patrons, and she's in the House of Lords, and she asked the question in the House at the time, And once she'd asked the question, why is it done, they released it and allowed the site to be built, even though it was nothing to do with them at the time as well. And that was done in the, that was actually passed through the committee stage. So it didn't actually go to an appeal, but that took God knows how many years. I mean, it really, really did. It was a horrible, horrible experience for everybody involved in that as well. But the amount of anger that comes up from local authorities, of local people, and they don't even know where the site is. Most people would never even know where that particular site was. They would never, if they were from Brighton Hove, they would never be able to find it. So this is the sort of thing, it's completely blown out of proportion, and it's very, very hard for people. I gave evidence in a meeting in public for a family. And it was at the Guildhall in an area in Surrey, and it was in the evening, and they actually had tickets to the door for the amount of people that turned up, and it was packed in there. And I think it was 3 minutes to talk about why the family should be given the planning on that day, and they were voting on that day. And I could not even hear myself speak because I was booed at, I was hissed at throughout. I was called names, there was swearing. In the end, the chair did nothing. I had to scream when I was talking into the microphone for this wonderful Romany family who was so proud, and they held themselves with such dignity during this awful, awful experience. I was held back with 2 colleagues who also were giving evidence for the family for an hour afterwards for my own safety. In a lovely leafy suburb of Surrey. You know, people should start looking at themselves and thinking, goodness me, what on earth is happening here? But that was my experience, and it's made me very anxious about actually doing that again. I mean, I would do it. I've done it in a smaller fields, but this was, this was out of my jurisdiction as well. And that brings us on to sort of like negotiated stopping. So that's something that you can do. It's probably something that was practiced during COVID. Local authorities have discretion around planning. They are allowed to let you stay somewhere at a time according to them. I mean, a lot of the legal teams get very anxious. Oh, if you stay there too long, you're giving license for that person. But if you come up with, an agreement, it could be a verbal agreement, or it could be a written agreement, or anything to say, right, you've said you're going to come here, you're going to be on this land for 6 weeks because you've got a funeral, a wedding, a hospital, a blah. We will direct you to this spot. We will provide you with portaloos and rubbish, and we expect you to behave like no fires, no this, no that, whatever. And then you're allowed to stay there and you've got permission, and that brings down the hate crime, and it also enables that person to stay there. You know, if you've got no transit site, why wouldn't you do that? This happened very effectively throughout the pandemic, and now we're suddenly going back to, right, we're moving you on, we've got no land, we've got no this, that and the other. We know the people have got it. You know, I've always asked local authorities, have you done a land audit recently? Have you done this? Some very good best practice sites like Bristol have opened up meanwhile sites. So basically, when a group of people come in, the person from Bristol City Council will go out and say, well, we've got some sites I can send you to. They're called meanwhile sites. They're sites that we own, but in the meanwhile, before we develop them, you're allowed on there. How many weeks would you want to go on there? For 3 months? Okay, that's understandable. And a contract is drawn up, and that reduces tensions with the wider community. It ensures people have got a safe space to stop. They've been given permission, and they've been provided with the portaloos, etc. Whether they're charged for them or not, I'm not quite sure, but there is a budget there. So that's something that can be done. Negotiation stopping is great. It's just a lot of the time local councillors don't like it because it looks like they are they're inviting travellers in. Travellers are going to be here for forever. They've been here forever. They're not going away. This is the point. You know, there's the whole thing about, trying to erase or scrub a culture that's been around since the Tudor England, and prior to that 11th century for Irish travellers in this country. So we're looking at something. Why push against it? Why not try to find something that's reasonable? So unauthorised encampments or roadside camps, that's when people are not getting offered negotiated stopping, where they have no transit provision, where there are no sites for them. This is on the roadside. So this is in the parks. This is in like the side of the roads, the highways, the green lanes, the field, and sometimes on private land as well, where people haven't got permission to be. And of course, we've discussed the impact of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. There's no impact at the moment, but I can guarantee you there will be, and it's serious, so it has to be nipped in the bud. Wide injunctions appeal. There's an appeal that went on about local authorities being able to use wide injunctions for their districts. So for example, Bromley initially did a wide injunction appeal, which was put out that said, nobody who's a traveller can park up in this whole district. And it was like the whole county wide, more or less. And lots of local authorities started using that. And it was particularly for persons unknown. So it meant that it was like a crystal ball. We don't know you, we don't know if you're a traveller, but you're not allowed to be on there anyway. And that's been taken to court. FFT were interveners in that. And again, it was successful. And then the local authorities banded together and it reduced down from about 36 to 12, who then decided to take it back to court again. So we are in a situation still with regard to the wide injunctions appeal. So we're still not there 100%. So we know there's a huge amount of people that have no place to stop. What do you think will happen? Basically, if you've got nowhere to stop and this continues and your health is impacted because you can't get a GP or you can't get into the school or you can't get that heart surgery and people from the community are dying 10 to 25 years sooner, eventually you are going to succumb to having to go into bricks and mortar accommodation, which has an impact on you, even not an impact that could be, immediate, for example, but it could take a while for you to suddenly be like, I'm not used to living like this. I mean, Chris, even you, when you went into bricks and mortar the first time, it's a big shock, isn't it? It's different.
Yeah, it's another world. It's like being taken to another planet, really, because it's all you've ever known. You're part of nature. You're sort of in nature. You spend most of your time outside, and then all of a sudden you've got the hard walls, walking the floorboards. It's completely different. And I don't think it ever goes out of your system, really.
I don't think it does. I don't think it does. I think, my mother-in-law, she had vertigo. She couldn't go upstairs. She was used to living on the ground. Suddenly to go into a house or anything which had stairs in or had, it feels sometimes. One of my colleagues, she had something called an aversion to bricks and mortar. So she was put into bricks and mortar accommodation while she was pregnant because she had preeclampsia and she got very ill. And her doctor said, you've got to go into accommodation where you're going to be settled somewhere just for the pregnancy. And she was so much iller in that accommodation because she said she just felt like everything was pressing in on her head. And it was actually a condition called aversion to bricks and mortar accommodation. As soon as she left it, it felt like the roof had come off of her head again. And this happens. So, and there was a really interesting bit of legislation that was passed many years ago. And I think it was Justice Seddon, I think it was, who said an elderly couple who had who had gone to the local authority, they were very old, they couldn't carry on traveling from place to place. They wanted somewhere to put their caravan. There was no room on the local site there, so they offered them a house and the couple turned it down. They couldn't go into this house, and then so it went to court. And the judge or the justice at the time said, actually, he said, offering this elderly couple bricks and mortar accommodation is akin to offering them to live in a rat-infested barn. It's a really important and famous case. Sadly, he didn't go further and say you had to provide a site. He said you didn't have anywhere to offer them, and they are not intentionally homeless because they turned this accommodation down. Therefore, the status quo is preserved. In other words, no one was in the wrong. So they were right to refuse the accommodation, and you did not have the accommodation to give. So neither of you were in the wrong. So that's more or less what that came out with. I wish he had gone and said, actually, local authority, you're in the wrong. You've got to provide a site, but it didn't happen like that. But it's still a really important legal challenge. And that sort of takes us on to boaters and bargees. Boaters are from the community, often from any walk of life that have joined. They could have come from the New Traveller community. Bargees are an ethnic group. And Christine, tell me about bargees.
Yeah, Ronnie Wood, Michelle. Yeah,
Ronnie Wood.
Yeah, from the Rolling Stones. His father was the last to be born on the water. So back in the day, I remember my parents talking about them, but they only referred to them as water gypsies. So their accommodation wasn't referred to as boaters or barges. They were, water gypsies. So in other words, they were the same as us, but instead of being on the road, they were on the water.
Brilliant, thank you. I have a lot of issues. I mean, I know in Cambridgeshire you do have boats, you've got canals, etc. There's a lot of issues with people being moved on, continuous cruising, very similar health and welfare outcomes that the traveller community have as well. It's a hard life being on the boats as well, particularly if you're down tow paths. It's very dark, they're not lit. It's very, very cold. If you get ice, you have to do a lot of physical work. It can really impact on you. There's a lot of solitary areas. There's people not accessing, healthcare in the same way. So there's a lot going on there. And van dwellers. Van dwellers actually have been around for centuries. If you look in old parish records, you'll notice the word van dweller come up all the time. It meant caravan dweller. A lot of local authorities have tried to switch the word to try to make it a separate group almost, but people who are living in their vans and they're called van dwellers, you don't have to look far back in parish records to know that. So basically that's who they are. Do you want to move on to the next one? Because I know we're getting short on time. I think we're finishing at 12, blimey. Yes, so let's move on. So as usual, so why do they occur? And I think I've gone through all of this: closure of traditional stopping places, chronic shortage, impact of the Police Crime and Court Sentencing Bill 22. What can we do to help? Liaise to provide amenities, so toilet provision and bins, signpost to specialist organisations like ourselves, support Gypsy Roma traveller with their needs, education, healthcare benefits, look at it very much in a positive welfare improvement way rather than an enforcement way, and work with housing associations to provide lands for sites temporary or permanent, because there's a huge untapped market there. Housing associations not only have they have the rights to provide socially rented accommodation, but also, like the reason they popped up in the first place was because of the lack of council provision at the time, and it was like that market, but also they had a social conscience background. So work with your local housing associations to provide land for the sites, or get them to manage your sites as well. Move on to the next one.
Yeah.
I think that hopefully elements to consider to identifying new sites, examples of best practice relating to site design. So go for places we're proud of. That's a really interesting document or book that you should read that was written by Joe Richardson and others looking at site design, and always get the community involved right at the beginning, because that's really important. Because if you were living somewhere, wouldn't you want to have some input into how to improve it? Implications and challenges, identifying sites, landowners, utilities and access. These are the main things. People, it's hard to, they are out there. I think, looking for sites, I think you start with your land audit and then go further. How to bring on board parish councillors and residents group. And the site design book, Helen, is places that we are proud of. So that's, and if you put places we are proud of, and I think it's actually was funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Yeah. So yeah, places I'm proud of. And there's also there's a Welsh document as well about site design, which is really, really good. So have a look at that as well. So the Welsh have got a slightly different legislation compared to England with regard. They still have a duty to provide. So there is a good book of site design there. Residents group to accept transit sites and permanent sites. Bring the board parish councils to listen to us. People like FFT who can advocate really well. And just, I've got, many people don't know, one of my colleagues, Tommy, he's a young man, he's a traveller from the show people community. He's a parish councillor. There are people who are actually in councils already, and residents groups. There are some residents groups, traveller residents groups as well. It's about taking away that fear. It's fear related. People are listening and have been indoctrinated with this fear from the moment they were born, right the way through their lives. If they all sat down and had a quick chat with Christine or with James, people's fears would disappear. So always look. Best practice, Brighton is very good example, St Michael's Way. Happy to talk to anyone afterwards. And I'll put my, James, if you want to put my email in the box, I can talk about the best practice at St Michael's, because I was very much part of getting this site put up. But I know that we're running out of time, and I know you want some questions. So if you want to move on. There we go. Question Q&A. So we've got like, I don't know, about 10 minutes, I think. So it should have been about half an hour, but carry on. And anything that we don't answer, I'm happy to answer, afterwards as well. So go ahead. Let's have some questions.
There was actually, sorry to interrupt, there was a question in the box that was a little while back. Someone asked if there was much, where is it now? Do we know what the uptake has been in South Cambridgeshire? So have you got any sort of idea of the uptake in South Cambridgeshire in terms of accommodation and pitches?
What the uptake of, what delivering sessions was that? I've just seen, thanks James, do you know what the uptake has been in South Cams? So,
sorry, I thought
delivering sessions,
accommodation, but they may have meant about delivering sessions actually.
Yeah, I think so.
It was
sorry, my bad. Misunderstood that. Yeah, Louise. Yeah.
Well, it was about sessions, like how many parish councils.
Well, I tell you what, we did last year. We did some sessions with councillors, which is quite positive. We've done sessions with the City of Cambridge councillors as well, which has been really good, because actually there's some very, very strong advocates within the council to provide sites. It's the same in Bristol. It's quite interesting. If you get people who are willing to stand up politically in a way and actually go, hang on, then it does bring more people on board. So it's a mixed response. I mean, we've had a couple of sessions. We've got two great people that advocate from the council here today. So people are getting those sessions organised for them already. So it's not bad compared to the rest of the country. You're like top of the league, Cambridge itself and City of Cambridge. So well done, you guys. Any other questions? Hands up or chat box, anything while we're here. You've got the wonderful Christine and James as well. So, please don't be shy. Thanks, Louise, by the way.
Another question, unless you
want to.
Sure.
Yeah, carry on.
I just, as you can probably tell from all the stuff I've been chucking in the chat, I've just kind of come across the odd book, and I just think it's a really amazing culture that we could learn a lot from. And I went Wysing Arts, which is just out of Bourne. I had a really amazing presentation with Delaney Labar, and
Delaney Labar, yeah.
She was talking about all the kind of symbology and stories, and it's just so rich, and we don't really get to hear about that. And I know I just wondered if you knew of any other organisations that were promoting kind of culture and arts.
I think you've got the Romany Arts Group, haven't you, in I can't remember now where they are. They're in Wales. It's Isaac Blake. Look at that. We at FFT do quite a lot of arts related work. We've got traditional skills workshops. We've got a big event going on in Sussex. Christine, who's, I don't know where you popped off to, Chris, but she's actually a Romany poet and storyteller, and she's
I'm here, Michelle.
Oh, you're there. So
yeah.
You've done lots of cultural work, haven't you?
Yeah, fortunately I had a little book published back in 2015, and I just did it to see if I could, because I'm dyslexic and I got the computer and then I could spell, so I thought, yep, let's go for it. But I never dreamt it would take me all over the place, literally all over the place, just reading and cultural awareness, and yeah, it's been amazing.
They're beautiful stories as well. And Christine also, she's done everything in the field of what you could do as a working Romany woman, haven't you, Chris? You've done road work, tree work, field work.
Yeah.
You've designed, she can make like the flowers, and it's wonderful. But the storytelling is, and the dancing as well. So there's a lot of like step dancing, music. So there are some resources out there. On our website, we've probably got some good things that we're promoting at the moment, particularly around this time. I mean, we go into prisons, we go into hospitals, we go into local authorities, we go into police, where we're always constantly trying to promote the positives, really. I mean, Crystal's Vardo is a theatre production that FFT take around the country, and it's a 55-minute, basically a 55-minute speed into the Romany traveller culture. It's fascinating, it's historically accurate, and it takes you through all the different Crystal's run away from school because she's been bullied and she's stolen, or she's chewed her granddad's grandfather's Vardo and horse, and she's gone off, and it's like a time traveling Vardo, and she stops at different times, and leading right up to the present day, and then beyond. It goes into the future as well. It's amazing. So that's a really good educational tool, but it's beautifully done. It's got great music, it's got great acting, you know, people from the community that are acting in it too. So yeah. Karen,
you've also got a Stony Wish coming up, Michelle.
Oh, yeah. Stony Wish in August. Hopefully you'll be there, Chris, doing something.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah,
good, lovely. Karen. Hello, Karen. Someone had their hand up.
I didn't unmute myself when I started talking.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you had any advice or best practice from other areas about things that local authorities can do to help kind of challenge and change the narrative around the discrimination that Gypsy, Roma and traveller people face. I mean, I just recently we have Midsummer Fair in Cambridge, which happens every year, and it's a really big cultural event. And there's often on social media in particular, like loud voices that are very negative. And I was just wondering, you know, what is there examples of roles that we as councils can play in supporting